Chapter 1. Buried Alive. It was raining again. A steady, unrelenting downpour that soaked the city and everything in on. David sat at his desk, staring blankly at the raindrops streaking down the window. His mind felt foggy as the weather outside, the dull, heavy fog that seemed to thicken every minute. David is an acclaimed actor who had been acting since childhood. His mind should be on his new role as a police officer, but the white light from his screen is jarring, and his mind is aloof. The last character he played was a sadistic serial killer. The title was The Woman in the Red Dress. The role took a toll on him. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake the tension in his skull and the persistent throb behind his eyes. Sleep had been elusive for weeks. Every time he closed his eyes, something kept him awake. Dreams, or rather nightmares, bled into reality. He could never quite pinpoint when they started or stopped, which frightened him most. He glanced at the clock. 1:37 a.m. The house was quiet. Too quiet. His apartment was old, and even the familiar sound of creaks and groans from the woods seemed muted tonight. It was as if the world was holding its breath. The apartment had always felt small, but now it felt suffocating. The walls closing in just a little more each night. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, as if they were watching, waiting. It was the exhaustion, he told himself. Lack of sleep playing tricks on him. But the feeling of being watched never entirely left him. David got up from his desk, pacing back and forth to shake off the oppressive weight of quiet. His reflection caught his eye in the hallway mirror as he passed. He stopped, staring at it as if seeing himself for the first time in days. His reflection seemed off. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow, but there was something else, something he couldn't quite place. He leaned closer, squinting at his reflection in the dim light. His eyes scanned his reflection, searching for anything peculiar. And then his reflection smiled. David jerked back, his heart hammering in his chest. He blinked rapidly, his mind scrambling for an explanation. It didn't happen. He was tired, that's all. His mind was playing tricks on him. Had to be. But as he turned away from the mirror, the hairs on his neck prickled. He could feel it. Something standing just beyond him, watching. He whipped around, but the hallway was empty. The mirror reflected nothing but his own pale face, wide-eyed and shaking. "Get a grip," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "You're losing it." But as he walked to the bathroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that his reflection was still watching him. Even after he was no longer there, David reluctantly grabbed his prescription bottle and swallowed the last pill, taking it with a shot of whiskey. The next night, the storm had picked up again. Thunder rumbled as lightning scorched the skies. The wind howled through the narrow alleyways. David lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. Sleep was a luxury he hadn't enjoyed in weeks, and tonight would be no different. He tossed and turned, his body restless. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel the presence again, watching, waiting, as if it was just out of sight, lurking in the shadows of his room. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it wasn't real, just a trick of his tired mind. But then came the footsteps. It was soft at first, just a gentle creaking on the floorboards. His breath caught in his throat. He strained his ears, heart pounding as he listened to the sound grow louder and closer. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone was walking through the hallway. David sat up in bed, his pulse racing. His room was dark, save for the faint glow of the street light filtering through his blinds. But the hallway just beyond his bedroom door was pitch black, the darkness that swallowed everything. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, breathing. Low, raspy breathing just outside David's door. He could hear the breathing as if it were right next to him. David stared at the door, his body frozen with fear. He wanted to get up, check, and ensure no one was there. But his legs wouldn't move. His mind screamed at him to stay still, not to open the door. Whatever was out there, he didn't want to see it. But what if it was all in his head? What if he was imagining this? He had to know. Slowly, he slid out of bed and crept toward the door. His breath shallow and quick. The doorknob was cold under his hand as he twisted it, pulling the door open just a crack. The hallway was empty. Silent. David let out a shaky breath, relief flooding his chest. There was nothing there. He was just overtired and on edge. But then, from behind him, he heard the breathing again. David spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The room was empty. There was no one there. But the sound of the breathing lingered in the air as if the source was standing right beside him, just out of reach. The following evening, Eric came over to run lines. Just 2 years ago, he was still working as a medical courier. David's on-set experience was his lifeline, helping Eric find his footing. The new action comedy script required chemistry they were only beginning to build, and the more time they spent together, the sharper their comedic timing began. David kept the mood light and upbeat. Eric's favorite band blared on the surround sound, while LED lights danced rhythmically with the bass. The air filled with savory aroma of freshly delivered pizza and wings, their steam curling in the dimly lit room. "Hey, David, I'm grabbing a slice," Eric called from the living room, his voice drowning through the pounding music. "I'm starving, man. I'm supposed to be on a protein diet." Eric dipped the steaming slice into a pool of ranch, the sauce spilling over the plate. From down the hall, David's voice cut through the noise. "Do it! Do it! Do it!" David's voice rapidly boomed from the bathroom with a sharp crescendo. Eric's attention snapped to the hallway. He fumbled for the remote and quickly turned down the volume. His pulse started to climb as he listened intently. David hastily shouted. His voice zoomed like rapid fire again. His voice was darker, raspier, heavy, like an anchor. "She's dead, David. You killed her." A cold shiver ran down Eric's spine. He paced towards the bathroom, his footsteps hesitant, his eyes locked on the door. As he approached, he saw a shadow moving just beneath the door. David was pacing back and forth. But then Eric froze, his heart palpitating. Another shadow was following David's movements, slightly out of sync. Someone else was in there with him, or something else. Eric's fist hovered, shaking, before he mustered up the courage to know, dreading what would answer. And then the talking stopped. The shadow no longer paced. Eric steadily pressed his ear to the bathroom door. His breath was caught in his throat as he stood alone in the dark hallway. The LED lights were still flickering in the distance, shining on his face. David swept the door open with haste, stunned to see Eric standing in the hallway like a deer in headlights. "Eric, everything all right, bud?" David asked earnestly, walking past him and heading for the savory pizza. "Yeah, no, I was just letting you know the pizza was getting cold." Eric stumbled on his words, but he couldn't help himself. He gazed into the bathroom, and to his astonishment, it was empty. But something caught his eye. Half an inch of dried-up mud overtook David's boots by the sink, and what looked like a torn shirt with a red substance was in the trash. Eric, are you lactose intolerant? What's the holdup? David shouted impatiently. His joyful spirit and high-pitched voice baffled Eric. Laughter filled the room as the night drew on. A stack of pizza crust and bones sat on the table. Eric managed to pull off the night without incident, but deep down he knew something was off. He sat there for a few extra moments, soaking in his newly purchased hybrid, and then drove off into the busy streets. Panic set in as David crashed to the floor of his bed. He looked at the time, 3:30 a.m. David could feel it now, the weight of something pressing down on him, suffocating him with its presence. His pulse thundered in his ears as he stumbled backward, crashing into the wall. His breaths came in short, ragged gasps, the room spinning around him. No, 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 he muttered, his hands gripping his hair. It's not real. This isn't real. The shadows in his room seemed to shift, stretching across the floor toward him. His mind was unraveling, splitting at the seams, and he didn't know how to stop it. Blurry visions of a woman in a red dress, her face pressed against his. Headlights guiding through a winding dirt road. Sparks from a shovel panting as someone fiercely dug a shallow grave. David's face reflected off the car as he yanked the woman down and filled the sin with fresh dirt. It's not real. Leave me alone, David shouted, moving around his dark bedroom, searching for the light switch. Then a voice, low, guttural, and chilling. You're not alone, David. The words echoed in his skull, reverberating through his mind. He clapped his hands over his ears, trying to block it out, but the voice grew louder. I've always been here, David. David screamed, stumbling forward and crashing through the hallway. His reflection in a mirror flashed by, but he didn't dare to look. David ran for the door, his feet pounding against the floorboards, his mind racing with terror. As he reached the front door, his hands fumbled with the lock. He yanked it open, stumbling out into the storm. The cold rain hit his skin, but it didn't calm him. The voice was still there, whispering in his ear, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. A whisper flowed through the falling rain. Run all you want. You can't escape me. David fell to his knees, clutching his head. He didn't know what was happening anymore. David didn't know what was real and what was in his mind. Was he losing grip on reality? Had he already lost it? And then, as quickly as it started, the voice stopped. Silence. Complete and utter silence. David knelt there, panting, his body trembling. The rain fell around him, but the world felt eerily still. He slowly looked up, his eyes scanning the street. Nothing. No figure, no voice. Just him. David returned to his apartment, drenched and shivering. He felt like he was losing his mind. The breath, the voice, it all felt too real to be just in his head. But every time he tried to grasp reality, it slipped further away. He staggered into the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink as he stared at himself in the mirror. His reflection looked back at him, wide-eyed in exhaustion. He was losing it. He was sure of it. Then, as he watched, his reflection moved. David froze. The reflection smiled. I want what you took from me, David. The voice wasn't in his head. It was coming from the mirror. David stumbled back, His reflection didn't follow. It stayed in the mirror, watching him with the same twisted grin. "You're not real," David whispered, shaking his head. "You're not me." The reflection laughed a cold, cruel sound that sent chills down his spine. "I am you, David," it said, its voice low and mocking. "I've always been you. You took my life, David. I want it back." David backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. The apartment walls seemed to close around him, the shadows growing darker and deeper. He was trapped. There was no escape. The reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass. "You can't run from yourself, David." David screamed, stumbling back as the mirror's glass began to crack. His reflection pushed harder, and cracks lined the mirror. The sound of shattered glass and the crunch of metal reverberating around the room. Reality blurred with repressed trauma as his arms flung around in a tumbling car. Shards of glass rocketed in the air as metal buckled and sparks clashed. Alcohol bottles rattled, and the remaining liquid spilled, drenching David's head in a pool of bad decisions. The weight of his body forcefully left him unable to move. His neck was stuck as the car lay top down in the middle of the hot road. David's blurred vision gazed to the back seat. Her beady eyes were wide open, a single strand of blood carved into her lifeless face. David's chest tightened as he reached for her, tears pooling in his eyes. His body felt like lead, pinned by the crushed metal. David reached out for her as the pain in his chest and broken glass from the mirror brought him back to reality. Why couldn't he escape it? The gravity of his failure crashed over him, just as it had that fateful day, making it impossible to distinguish past from present. David tried to bury his past with heaps of pharmaceuticals and hollow therapy sessions. The reflection's grin widened, satisfaction oozing through his twisted teeth as it forced the glass forward. The shards scattered, distorting his reflection as it stepped through. The air seemed to thicken, a chill seeping into David's bones like the room recoiled in dread. His reflection inhaled like a newborn breathing for the first time. David fell to the floor, his mind splintering. His reality crumbling around him. The reflection loomed over him, its twisted grin growing wider. "You're weak, David." The reflection's voice filled with contempt, squeezing David's neck with a crushing grip, slamming David to the floor. The breath was ripped from his lungs. The room seemed to shrink as his vision blurred, and the life was being squeezed out of him. "I've come for my property, David." His words dripped with venom, as each word was sharp and cold. And then David's world went black. Chapter 1. Buried Alive.